The blood on her face is not her own. It clings to the hollows of her cheekbones like a mask she has been made to wear. The wind tastes of iron and ash. The canvas of the war tent flaps against a pole, and the smell of damp wool and smoke presses close. Brenia kneels in the mud beside a broken pyre, while her people's tents still smoulder behind her, a row of gaunt silhouettes against an indifferent dawn. At her feet, the spear bored into the earth holds a trophy that makes every bone in her chest hollow. The king's head, the face she once named with ceremony and touch, mounted and stripped of prayer. When they brought her forward, they did not cut the cords of her identity clean. They left the priestly braid at the nape of her neck still intact, that small, stubborn sign that she had once been both crown and oracle. That small insult saved her from certain scatter. To the Romans, she was not only a conquered subject, she was a ledger entry, a bargaining chip, an object of protocols. They looked at what she carried in her head, the names of safe houses, the flow of coins, the ritual calendars, and they balanced her worth against their appetite for trophies and the discipline of their machinery. Legatus Gaius Cornelius Scipio sat on a low stool in the center of the tent and, like all men of order, studied what he could measure: the length of her hands, the manner of her eyes when she was addressed, the way her shoulders had learned to tuck themselves inward. He moved maps and ledgers as if they were offerings to a god. Around him, officers with clipped beards and glinting brooches watched with a practiced impassivity that was not cruelty, but bureaucracy, the more efficient species of brutality. "Queen," Scipio said, his voice even. He pronounced the title as if it were both an honor and a curiosity. "What name do your sons bear? Where do you keep the precincts of your treasury? Give me the truth, and perhaps you will find favor. Hide the truth, and the camp will speak for you." She looked at him as one who observes weather. Brenia had learned to measure the space between words. She counted the ticks as other women counted beads. The cold had reduced speech to essentials. Her body told stories she would not surrender. The way she pressed her palms against the wet earth, the way she held her breath when it thundered in her ribs. She was careful to let the Romans see only what she chose. "I am Brenia of the Nurvi," she said. "You have my head. You have my kingdom's spoils. My sons are in the custody of the Northern Watch. You will find them when you follow the old hunting trail and the ash-gnarled oak beyond the third stream." Scipio allowed a small smile, precise and unreadable. He had expected bargaining. Every legatus expected bargaining. He had not expected finesse. "So your sons are hidden with hunters," he said, tapping a stylus against a map. "Yes," she replied. Her answer had the plausibility of a narrative crafted for the purposes of delay. He leaned forward, more curious than threatening. "We do not like hunters, Brenia. Hunters draw pay for meat, not for harboring heirs of kings. Do you think to buy time with forest stories?" She did not answer. Instead, she performed the thing she always had. She invoked an older authority, not to beg, but to remind. "The Druids mark winter by the third moon," she said. "Patterns are held with hands that understand patterns." It was neither a confession nor a lie. It was a movement. The legatus could not seize it and claim it as proof. Around them, the camp kept its rituals. Chains sang when dragged. Men counted spoils on blankets, compasses glinting. The war tent smelled of oil and linen and a human calculus. There was a rhythm to how Rome processed what it conquered. Theft made orderly, suffering made profitable. Brenia had watched it in other camps, learned its arithmetic. She knew the sequence by which a people's wives, daughters, and honored women were stripped from the map of living relatives and distributed through the empire's market of power. She had once been queen and priestess, the keeper of roots that mattered to survival. She had also been mother. Between those two certainties, she found in captivity a new tradecraft, how to trade truth for time. Scipio's hand moved across the map, dragging a small iron counter to a cluster of marks that represented the burned villages and emptied granaries of the Nurvi. His face, when he looked back at her, had the flatness of a man who had long meditated upon order and the uses of fear. "We have records," he said. "Not everything you say can stand." "You have the records because you took them," she answered. "You ask me to confess what you already own." The legatus laughed once, short. "You speak cleverly for a refugee. That cleverness will cost you." He set his jaw as if preparing his next move, one that could reduce her to commodity or employ her as intelligence. Between those options, he saw a neat profit. He saw trophies to hang on his wall and favors to ask in the forum. He also saw a way to bend the Nurvi's knowledge to Roman purposes. Map trails turned into supply routes, druid contacts turned into informants, ritual calendars turned into timing for raids. Women like Brenia were repositories. The Romans treated such women according to a hierarchy that combined prudence with appetite. What followed in the interior voice of a civil order was not spoken, but practiced across the empire. The system for processing captive women was cruelly simple and calculated. At one end of the line were mass sales, the women who were counted, stripped of rank, bound to market stalls, priced by youth and labor. They would pass into foreign households, into servitude that might dull memory by the persistence of domestic work. This was the most efficient method for converting people into resources and erasing the particularities of a conquered population. At the other end were the trophies, the highborn who were taken for spectacle. Queens and priestesses were sometimes preserved intact, displayed at triumphs, assigned to an officer's tent as status objects, or kept as bargaining chips. These women retained, in the eyes of the empire, symbolic value. The presence of a foreign queen at a legatus's board was a demonstration of dominion. Between these poles, there existed a more insidious category, the processed converts. The Romans would sometimes integrate women into local Romanized households, arranged marriages, adoptions into Roman patrons, where their memory of a homeland was slowly phagocytized into loyalty, a domestic assimilation that served the imperial project. And beneath all of these layers was a tacit infrastructure, registers, letters, sentries, and informants that turned a social population into data and then into actionable intelligence. Brenia, who had once routed messages through sacred glades, understood the contours of that hierarchy as precisely as any officer's ledger. What made queens valuable was neither the glory nor the silk. It was the specific, tacit knowledge they carried, routes of sanctuary, names of safe houses, the passwords and signs that kept the clandestine alive. To the legatus, such knowledge could be harvested to make the empire more secure and its punishments more thorough. "You understand how we proceed," Scipio said, returning them both to the tent's dim light. "You know that we must decide your fate according to Roman law and advantage." Her eyes slid to the spear bearing her husband's head. The sight did not unseat her. She had been baptized in loss that day. The chill inside her was not just grief, but a resolute, practical cold, the kind that sharpens thinking to an edge. "Then choose," she said. "Choose how you will use me." He considered, made a ledger in his mind that counted not only goods, but leverage. If he made her entertainment, if he placed her among the legion's spoils, he would anger certain politicians back in Rome who argued for less brutality. If he sold her, he would fill coffers and quiet his centurions. If he integrated her into the system as a source of information, he would gain a living map. There was profit and risk in each path. Scipio raised a finger, more to himself than to her. "You will come with us," he said at last. "You will tell me what you are willing to tell, and we will decide what is useful." She accepted the terms without spectacle. It was not compliance, it was calculation. Every time a Roman thought he had bent an enemy to his will, A defeated person could measure how best to play that expectation. Brenia's intelligence was not only the names of roads, it was the art of appearing to yield when she meant to shape. Outside, the camp's life continued in its small mercantile cruelties. Women from neighboring tribes stood, hands bound with twine, waiting to be called in the order the officers had prepared. The line of captives curved like a broken braid. Young faces stared at the earth, old faces counted off kin in their heads, some mouthed prayers, while others rehearsed the names their skin refused to give up. They were not all the same. Each had a story that the empire would try to fold into ledger lines. Each would be judged according to the Roman logic of use. It was here, in this halting space between humiliation and policy, that Brenia did a thing that would shape the next year of her life. She chose to give the legatus a piece of truth that was not entire truth. She told him of a cache, an ironsmith's hidden ledger and a deposit of coins, placed in the hollow of a dead hill fox trench, near a hamlet whose name the Romans would recognize, but where they would not expect a sanctum to exist. It was the sort of detail that required a man to leave his maps and go until his feet had blisters. A detail that the legatus could verify, but only after time and 2 inconvenient crossings. Scipio nodded, and the mercantile calculus in his face shifted. A plausible bounty, an acceptable proof, a delay. He asked who had buried it. She named a trader whose name sounded old and common. That should have been enough. It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth. Brenia watched him plan the small expedition into the ash-grey dawn, and in the metallic clink of his intent, she heard the rhythm of time bought. In that rhythm, she placed her sons. Before the expedition could dislodge the first stone from the fox trench, however, a new actor arrived at the camp, a man with the gait of someone used to living by compromise. He called himself Marcus Aurelius Cato on transaction papers, but the men who served under him shortened the name into a clipped single-syllable co. As a tribune, he was both an administrative knot and a political temperature gauge, part enforcer, part diplomat, and entirely interested in who would best preserve Rome's long-term governance in the province. Where Scipio was a predator with leisured tastes, Co was a pragmatist, whose appetite was empire in bureaucratic form. He stepped into the tent like a man entering a chessboard, where someone had already moved pieces. His interest in Brenia was not primarily for trophies or immediate profit. Instead, he saw her as a potential lever to manage unrest and to create local stability in ways that placated the Senate's whispers back in the city. He offered a different bargain: protection for her children, a place for them within Roman patronage, and in exchange a willingness to use her knowledge as a broker, to translate local customs into administrative solutions that would make rebellion less likely. "You have an order in which things must be set if we are to hold this region," Co said in the low baritone of someone used to negotiation. "Trophy and terror can work, but only for a season. What we need is continuity. Women like you, who know names and rights, can become instruments of calm if they are placed rightly. They can teach sons to be loyal to new masters." There was no kindness in his words, only utility. Even so, his proposal reframed the terms of captivity into something else, an exchange of futures. Brenia listened, keen as a woman who had watched granaries burn and harvests stolen. Co's offer, in practical terms, meant survival for her heirs, and a gradual wearing away of the stigma her people would carry if her sons were seen as living relics. It was a substitution. Exile for lineage preserved. Scipio watched the interchange between them with the wary patience of a man watching a market. He understood that Roman factions existed even in the fields. There were men who relished spectacle and immediate conquest. There were men who preferred assimilation and the authorized slow conquest of hearts. Co belonged to the latter. That division mattered because it offered Brenia leverage, the ability to play between appetites and to choose not only survival, but also the terms under which that survival might unfold. She asked Ko what guarantee he could provide. He smiled at the question as if it were a puzzle he had been asked before and given an answer to many times. "I can promise influence. I can promise letters that place a family under a patron's watch. I can promise a station where your sons might be enrolled and provisioned." "Promises are written on parchment," Brenia said. "Parchment can be burned." "And yet parliaments burn less quickly than bodies," Ko replied. It was a hard, almost merciless way to frame the world. Brenia took it as information, who offered what and how much trust it required. She had been trained to read both prophecy and ledger, the priestess's skill and the queen's necessity. In Scipio's ledger she saw immediate danger. In Ko's soft machinery she saw a chance at embedding her sons within Rome's very engine, learning the language of the empire from the inside so they could, if necessary, one day use it against it. She did not speak of revenge. She had no time for melodrama. But in her mind she began to draw a long map. If the boys were raised within Roman institutions, if they learned the cadence of Roman law and the networks of patronage, they could move as insiders. They could be taught to carry the small Nervian signs between their ribs like flossed truths, a word in a lullaby, a symbol sewn into robes, a recipe of prayer. Memory, she knew, was an unquantifiable currency. It did not require the return of fields to survive. It required heirs who could tell the stories. Ko's proposal was not generous, it was strategic. He wanted to stabilize a province and curry favor with men in Rome who liked to see their policies bear the gloss of order. For Brenia, it was a form of barter, her sons' bodies for the survival of her people's memory. While these actors negotiated, other, smaller mechanical cruelties were being enacted by the Roman system. Lists made, orders given, the sorting and packaging of people into categories. The officers assigned to the line made quick calculations, names to record, possessions to inventory, hair to measure for taxes. The camp's clerks scratched letters on wax tablets and numbered bodies like cargo. It is important here to say plainly what those categories implied for the women under the legion's tents, without dwelling on the private horrors they may have endured in the name of spectacle. The empire had, through cold practice, devised ways to neutralize political bodies: forced marriage, servile absorption, relocation to distant households, and assignment as rewards for soldiers and officers in need of social brokerage. In practice, this meant that a defeated people's women were often distributed in ways that stripped them of public power and preserved them only insofar as their presence served Roman needs: sexual, domestic, administrative. That system's violence was systemic rather than theatrical, a discipline that misaligned the terms of kinship and memory. Brenia was not naive to this calculus. She understood that her bargaining with Scipio and Co. would at times look like capitulation. She also understood that capitulation could be engineered to become counter-capital, information withheld, truth half-shared, time purchased. When the legatus prepared a small party to verify the Fox trench cache she had described, she watched the men load supplies, saw their shields glint, and counted stones in their path like beads marking a prayer. Delay was an instrument. Falsehood, when used carefully, was a weapon that obeyed no law but survival. After Ko left the tent, having placed a quiet promise, Scipio's officers returned. The expedition to the Hollow revealed only a handful of rusted trinkets and a trader's ledger, everything a man might expect when he seeks proof, but finds instead a staged trace. The Roman party's return left the legatus with a bruise of doubt. He paced the tent's periphery as he considered his options. He could execute an immediate brute force policy, disperse the captives, sell and move on, or he could invest in a longer game by using Brenia's knowledge as if it were statecraft. He liked the latter. It allowed him to place his name on memorial stones back in Rome and whisper to senators of his orderly governance. Brenia, in the meantime, was afforded a strange, small mercy. She was kept not in chains, but under the watch of a household that was meant to make her useful. The Romans have a word, domus, that is both home and instrument. Her days began to reframe into lessons. A scholar at Scipio's table might ask her about religious timings, while a scribal hand copied lines she had once used to mark the seasons. She gave them small truths and measured omissions like a woman balancing a scale. On the third evening after the Fox Trench drama, when the sun slid away and the camp's torches threw long shadows, someone shoved a folded letter into her hands. The script, tight, pressed, with a particular hook on the final K, made her throat tighten. It was a small thing, a man's private hand that named a place and time. Her brother Cadoc's handwriting, when she had kept it in her memory, had a certain crooked kindness. She had not expected to see it here. At first she thought the letter a trick. Her mind ran through catalogues of possibility, a Roman forger, a trap, another ploy. She touched the paper and felt the residue of tobacco smoke and the salt of human breath. The words inside were few but sharp in their implicature. He had drawn a map in shorthand, a quick set of marks that corresponded to the old trade path she had taught him as a child. There was a note about coordinates and a pin, a location where one could find a wagon hidden under reeds, a repeated phrase about the North Bend that only someone who had ridden the road daily would know to mark. Brenia folded the letter slowly, feeling the weight of not only ink, but intention. If Cadoc had sent this map willingly to Roman hands, then the small web of safe houses she had cultivated would be exposed. If, instead, the legatus had coerced him, then the betrayal was more complicated and more painful. Kin sold out not for coin, but for fear, for promises, for some private preservation at another's cost. She did not look up as Scipio re-entered. His face was unreadable in the wavering light. "You have been counselled," he said. "Your brother's hand reaches far." Brenia's fingers tightened on the letter. The tent narrowed around them like a throat. There was a sound beyond the canvas. Horses, a distant argument, the soft carrion-feathered noise of a world that had grown used to the shivering of others. Everything changed in one moment, an old man's crooked script on a scrap of parchment. Scipio read the crooked script like a ledger revisited. His eyes skimmed the marks, stopped at the pin that had been set with the care of someone who knew a road by its potholes, and not by any official chart. The tent seemed narrower. The metal rings of the map case clinked as if nervous. "You were counselled," he said again, softer this time, testing the limits of civility. "Your family reaches farther than you believed." Brenia folded the paper with slow, precise movements. She kept her face unreadable. In that pause, the legatus considered options with the patience of a man accustomed to calculus. If Cadoc had indeed betrayed safe houses, then the network that had kept fugitives and caches would be compromised. If the map were genuine, Scipio could seize the heirs and make a display of the Nervi's extinction through the erasure of its lineage. "You sent him to trade," she said quietly, the accusation thin as breath and heavy with memory. "He was always fond of markets." Scipio made no comment on motive. Motives mattered less than movement and cost. "We move at dawn," he said. "The North Bend will not be hard to find with your brother's hand to guide us." Brenia's palms lay open on her knees. She felt the coldness of the earth through the thin fabric, and beneath that cold, a different pressure, time collapsing into a single axis of choice. If her sons were captured, they would not be only pawns in a ledger. They would be taught new names, given new fathers, folded into a system that dissolved origin through habit and law. If they were taken alive into Roman custody without her control, their memories would be skimmed, their loyalties annexed. The ledger could not be forgiven by the heart. She thought of the little marks she had cut behind a cupboard slat in the family cart, 3 shallow notches, each for a year, on the wood that cradled a child's foot. She imagined those notches being unlearned, sanded out by tutors and time. The thought tightened the line of her jaw. Outside the tent the camp wound and buzzed. A courier ran brief orders. Slaves rolled over sleeping men. The fires had been banked, then stoked anew. A soldier came in to report the logistics of the expedition. Horses, food, the number of archers. Scipio nodded, making his own calculations visible now, turning them into commands. He would take a fast party, show the banners, present proof to any who resisted, and be back before the sun had done its 3rd climb. Roman speed was shame and a lesson at once. Co, when he heard of the map, moved differently. Where Scipio saw a route to trophy, Co felt the tremor of a longer game. He arrived at the tent without the pomp of a leader, but with the quiet force of someone who understood networks rather than blades. "You will not find honor in what you seek," Co said to Scipio, stepping into the dim, where the tent smelled of smoke and old fears. "If you strip the children from their mother, you will not merely break a line, you will exhume fury that does not die with a head on a spear." Scipio's reply was a measured curl of his mouth. "We do not run a charity tribune, we run an empire." Co's eyes softened with the austerity of his method. And empires last longer when they can place sons on thrones, turned Roman by will and habit. "You will make enemies today that we cannot buy back tomorrow." It was a political argument disguised as strategy. Scipio weighed it in silence. He liked to see the world as a series of immediate verifications, an action, a return, a ledger entry. Co's world required patience and the placing of trust in the slow accrual of influence, the kind of profit that did not shine in a day. That was when the legatus made the decision that would shape Brenia's next steps. He sent a contingent north with orders to secure the route and verify the map, and he kept her within the purview of his household. Whether from appetite or prudent politics, he chose a mixed course, the theatre of quick victory, while he considered other subtler gains. Brenia watched the men leave with the feeling of watching a tide. She had made the map plausible enough to send them. She had left them a trail that required footsteps and time. But time, she knew, was a brittle mercy. If Cadoc's hand had indeed written the route, then there was an immediacy to the danger she had only partially forestalled. The letter burned with more than ink. It burned with the possibility that kin had chosen colonization for whatever private reasons: fear, barter, self-preservation. Betrayal, she had learned in earlier years, wore many faces. The legacies of loss were often carried in those small, crooked scripts. She thought of the countless women who had been parceled out, trophies, sales absorbed into domus, and of the invisible work they performed, keeping secret words in lullabies, embedding prayers into bread, teaching children to count by seasons that no Latin tongue would name. Those women were not recorded in legions, they were remembered in memory, and memory was the thing empires could not account for until it moved like a wave. It is worth saying plainly here how the Romans typically processed captive children and the heirs of conquered nobles. The empire did not merely take persons, it recatalogued futures. Sons of status might be adopted into Roman households or placed under patrons, their education remade in the grammar of loyalty. Daughters might be married to local clients to create bonds or carried into Roman houses to become symbols of submission. This practice was both administrative and psychological. By remolding lineage, Rome sought to make annexation last beyond the battlefield. If this was a system, it was a system with seams. Before dawn the next morning, Co came to Brenia with a plan that smelled of wood smoke and risk. He brought draped maps, the names of men who knew how to ride without being seen, and an outline of a rescue that resembled a prayer in its slenderness. "We can take them," he said simply, "but not if the legatus reaches the North Bend first. We need a diversion, a false trail, and riders who know the reed paths. Your brother's map will bring a party, we will bring another. Your sons will be taken west to a patron who owes me a favor. You will be left in a controlled custody that makes your removal politically costly. No spectacles, no auctions. Quiet. How many risk their lives for such quiet? Brenia asked. More than you think, Ko replied. There are men in the province who would rather have peace than glory. There are sailors who do not love Rome, but love the coin that keeps their mouths shut. There are druid women who remember you, and will move as ghosts. The druid network that Brenia had once trusted was brittle and clandestine. They were not a standing force. They were a lattice work of safe houses, sympathizers, traders with memory, and women who had learned to read signals in hearth smoke. For 12 years, those cells had kept one another alive in small ways. A salted ham sent under a false name, a child hidden in a convent of sorts, a message sewn into a cloak hem. The network had an ethic: preserve kin, pass messages, take measure of the enemy, and it owed Brenia favors for the favors she had once rendered. Ko named faces and places. Brenia listened and measured. The plan required the secrecy of the druids, the duplicity of merchants, and the willingness of Roman functionaries to misdirect their superiors. It required that she accept a public humiliation to hide a private victory. It required the indulgence of the legatus's appetite for spectacle, while Ko's men did the true work. Brenia folded her palms around the warmth of the clay pitcher beside her. She had always translated prayer into action. Here, prayer meant packing small things into the boys' belts: a scrap of woven cloth with a Nervian knot, a lullaby line whispered into fabric, a hidden sign to pass along to the druids should they be separated from her. She taught them, in the night before their leaving, how to braid a lock of hair so that a soldier's inspection missed the tiny symbol stitched into the braid. She taught them what to sing that was not Latin, and how to fold their refusal into obedience. At the hour when the world was neither night nor fully dawn, the rescue began. Ko's riders moved along reed-hidden tracks, while a small contingent from Scipio's camp made the route Caddoc had described. At a farm hollow near the North Bend, the two lines crossed in the darkness, like two knives that did not find each other. The sons were taken from a small hamlet where a trader had hidden them with a woman who kept geese. They were of the age where faces still carried the roundness of childhood. They clung to their savior's skirts and began the disciplined choreography of being handed, litre by litre, from one authority to another. They did not know the extent of the danger. They knew only that they were being carried until the road dipped and their world narrowed to the sway of a cart. Brenia watched them go. She had the map of their life in her hands, the lullabies, the knots, the small marks. She made a bargain with herself. She would be the price if the currency could buy their continuity. When Scipio's men discovered the empty reed path and the hollow barn, with only the ghost of a cart's track, they cursed and returned to the camp with raised bile. The legatus realized, in the bitter moment when a promised spectacle had been deflected, that he had been outmaneuvered not merely by cunning, but by a municipal subtlety he had not priced. The party returned to the tent with stale air and the sense of a plan unclosed. In the aftermath, as men questioned routes and blamed one another, Ko called Brenia to him. "Leave with us," he said, "not in chains, in custody, but on terms. We can move you where no Roman eye will ask a question easy to answer. You will be my ward. Your sons will be placed under patronage, raised in Latin, given opportunities. The druid network will scatter you in ways that do not make good spectacle." Brenia measured her options the way she had once measured the tides. The choice was not simple. Exile meant a different kind of death, the slow dilution of authority, the erosion of a living throne into a memory. Yet the boy's survival meant a preservation of blood and story. It meant that the Nervi's voice could continue, whispered and taught under the tongue, rather than declared in the council. She agreed. She mounted a cart and watched the last of her people's tents become thin columns of smoke. A man came to take the king's head from the spear. Brenia turned away before the sight could lodge as ritual and not horror. The caravan left at dusk. The sons were taken to Roman houses, where they learned to call the legate patron and to answer in Latin. They were given tutors who drilled them in Roman history and law, in the manner of comportment that would one day let them sit in a forum. The boys became something else outwardly, Romanized heirs on paper, Nervian in the hollows of lullabies. Brenia, meanwhile, was made to wear a robe that smoothed her outline. She moved among Roman households with a calm that was partly strategy and partly the learned mask of those who survive by blending. Co placed her with patrons who valued her as an advisor on the customs of the provinces. He used her to craft policies that would pacify certain areas. In so doing, he bought her a slow kind of power, proximity to decision-makers, the ability to whisper into the ears of men who counted votes and coin. What she learned in those years was not merely a foreign tongue, but the grammar of empire. She learned how to file petitions, how to insert a phrase into an official dispatch so that a commander would be compelled to act. She taught her sons, in the privacy of a kitchen while Roman tutors catalogued Latin declensions, the Nervian words for hearth rites. She made them memorize a line from a prayer she had once said beside a warm stone, and told them to clip it out of easy ears like a secret coin. 12 years slid past, as if by slow hands. The boys grew into men who could address a senate clerk or kneel to a patron with equal ease. They might have been mistaken for Romans by most. By some, they were still Nervian in the way they set bread to cool or counted seasonal fires. They kept the notches behind the cupboard slat. The wood had not been sanded. Brenia's assimilation was not traitorous. It was tactical. She moved through patronage like a woman learning to map her enemy's incisions. She became a consultant who taught Roman officials how to arrange ritual calendars so that local populations felt their traditions honored enough to quiet themselves. In doing so, she translated the habits of memory into administrative terms. She taught magistrates which festivals might be allowed and which rites could be reshaped into acceptable civic solemnities. This, paradoxically, made her indispensable and dangerous. The Druids, in parallel, had not been idle. They kept channels, sent couriers under merchant cover, and slowly rebuilt a lattice that could support more than small rescues. They learned Roman routines as Brenia did, so that their obfuscations were precise. Where once they hid people in hollow trees, they began to hide messages in ledger pages and channels of trade. They learned how to place a word in a slave's wax tablet and have it travel to the correct house in the city. Information became a weapon as effective as steel. Scipio's career continued outward, and with it his reputation. He took victories that appeared moderate to the Senate and ruthless to the provinces. Yet, he miscalculated the velocity of influence. Men who had favored spectacle found themselves pressed by those, like Co, who valued long-term control. Scipio's appetites made enemies among men who thought him careless with diplomatic entanglements. His political enemies began to look for flints. Brenia's plan was not a single dramatic moment, but a sequence, years of placed words, of false reports and real sabotage, of carefully timed leaks. She had learned to speak Roman in the language of procedure. Petitions could be delayed if a clerk misplaced a stamp. Supply convoys could be rerouted if a governor's messenger insisted on an alternate route. A senatorial auditor could find a ledger misplaced for weeks if the right hand did not look. She paired these bureaucratic misdirections with the physical actions the Druids still excelled at: sabotaged wagons, false flags of scandal, and the mobilization of local men who had reasons aplenty to take arms if convinced that the time was propitious. It began, small and nearly invisible. A shipment of grain that Scipio expected did not arrive to the legion. The captain swore it was stolen. Letters from local magistrates complained of unrest. and Scipio's orders to disperse muttered into different ears. Auxiliaries raised from nearby tribes were slowed at checkpoints by forged documents. A minor rebellion in a neighboring district was allowed to chatter loudly enough that the legate had to send troops to stabilizing chores. The more Scipio stretched to cover the flares, the thinner his control became. At the same time, Brenia cultivated enemies for him. Men who had been slighted by Scipio in minor ways, refused promotions, unpaid debts, or public scorn, found in her a quiet interlocutor who could place their grievances in the right forum. She fed information to Co and the governor's quieter critics, placing small facts that swelled into credibility. She ensured that Scipio's chain of command contained the seeds of its own failure. What made the plan effective was not brutality, but plausibility. The empire's machinery believed its own open forms. It could be made to collapse by those who learned to operate its forms with greater cunning. Where Scipio depended on visible force, Brenia depended on invisible coordination. The final stage came in a month of cold rains that turned the roads to mud. Scipio found himself in a province where the treasury groaned under the cost of supplying distant forts and pacifying newly annexed districts. Food shortages tightened the populace. In that tension, rumors spread like mold. One night the governor received a dispatch, an apparently unsigned account of Scipio's mismanagement, alleging that his troops had requisitioned grain without authorization and that he had been negligent in protecting supply lines. The tone was documentary, the kind of thing the Senate's clerks would read with an eyebrow and then send to a committee. For Scipio, it meant that men at the center were now watching him. For his enemies, it meant the ceremonial knife. When the committee arrived to audit his command, they found irregularities, missing manifests, altered reports, and testimonies from officers too frightened to speak frankly. The audit was a public humiliation dressed as administration. Scipio defended himself with the same competence he had used to plan campaigns, but the evidence, small and precise, was damning. Men who had once been his allies found it politic to distance themselves. The legatus could not imagine that the instruments of his ruin had been his own practices turned against him. The bureaucratic forms he treasured had been weaponized by a former queen who knew how to hide a message in a ledger. There was no single battlefield where he fell. He fell in halls of paper and in the slow erosion of trust. Stripped of part of his command and recalled to Rome to answer questions, Scipio left the province with the same armor that had won him promotions, but without the certainty of support. His enemies paraded fragments of his failures before the Senate. His name was not hanged on a spear, it was tarnished in public record. Brenia watched the fallout with a reserve that never quite touched triumph. She had spent 12 years arranging small violences and quiet deceptions to unmake a man's authority. She had orchestrated the disappearance of grain convoys and the misdirection of dispatches. She had paid merchants and taught druids to forge stamps on wax. But when Scipio's carriage left the province, the part of her that had believed revenge would replant a nation found the result incomplete. Destruction of one man's career did not return burned fields. It did not remap the land beneath the feet of the Nervi. There was, however, a private justice awaiting. Cadoc's betrayal had not gone unnoticed. In the time after the rescue, rumors had found him like a scent. Reports spoke of a man seen at a Roman market with the look of someone who had given up on a people. He had married, as some said, either a woman who promised him shelter or a Roman client who offered clemency. The exact detail did not matter. What mattered was that the sons, now men trained to move in two tongues, had found his tracks. They found him not in the open square, but in a house by a canal where he had tried to live under a name that would blur his past. They took him at night, quietly and without spectacle. The sons had been trained in the arts of influence and also in the necessity of a different justice, private, not theatrical. They brought him to a place outside the city, to the hollow where the old traders met the fishermen and where the druid network kept one of its small altars. There, with no public drum, they gave him what their people had long accorded traitors, a judgment rendered by a council that still remembered kinship codes. The execution was not a display. It was rapid, a closure of a small chapter that had hurt more by its betrayal than by any measurable violence. Cadoc's last expression was not cinematic. It was the blunt face of a man who had chosen survival and had perhaps believed wrongly that survival granted impunity. When his life ended, there was a quiet that was heavier than triumph. Brenia watched from the shadowed edge of the clearing as her sons returned, their faces set into the stoic masks of men who had done a thing that would not unmake grief. There is moral cost in such acts. Brenia understood that the stain of blood, even justified blood, does not erase the first wrong. Revenge is a narrowing thing. It closes certain doors while opening others. Her sons had taken the deed into their hands, but she had not sought spectacle. She had sought continuation, the safety of memory in human vessels who could speak Nervian under a Roman sky. In the weeks that followed Scipio's removal and Cadoc's end, Brenia set to work on the more durable task she had imagined for years, the preservation of story. She gathered, as she had years earlier, the women who had survived and placed them in a network of exchange that did not depend on geography. They taught songs in kitchens, baked breads with secret signs pressed into crusts, and stitched symbols into linings of cloaks. They created a corpus of small rituals, ways of marking seasons and mourning that could be taught within a Roman household, and yet carry meaning that Rome could not decipher. She also worked to secure material traces, a ledger hidden in a soothsayer's trunk that listed names of sanctuaries, a set of carved wooden figures hidden in a wool merchant's stall, a line of a prayer etched in a pillar of a bathhouse disguised as graffiti. These were not grand artifacts. They were practical packets of continuity. They were designed to survive neglect and to be read by those who had permission to understand the code. When the sons, now men in the prime of their lives, sat with her, they spoke not of crowns, but of the responsibility of memory. Rome had allowed them to learn lore and rhetoric. They had used those tools in ways their teachers had not suspected. One taught scribes how to misplace a document in a way that would keep a network alive. The other used his place in a patron's household to smuggle letters under the thinness of wax seals. Both wore in public the training of Romans. Both carried, in private, the rituals of Nervi. Brenia aged in a skin shaped partly by Roman linen, but warmed by her people's hearths. Her priestly braid, once cut for the sake of humiliation, had been allowed to regrow as a symbol no Roman law could inventory. She never again took a place of public sovereignty, nor did she desire it. She found instead a different kind of influence, the slow crafting of institutions within institutions. There is an important lesson here about how the instrument of empire can be turned, in small and sustained ways, against itself. Rome worked through registers and patrons and the assumption that people could be remade by routine. Brenia learned those routines and inserted fissures. She taught her sons to value two sets of loyalties and to use the language of administration to protect the language of memory. It was not a revolution in a single night. It was a strategy across years. When Scipio's public disgrace rippled back into the province, it opened spaces that others filled. Men who had been discreet in their opposition found opportunities to claim favors and to place protégés. Coe, who had engineered many of the more administrative moves that preserved certain populations, found that his influence at Rome had repaid him with the placement of men who valued his kind of order. His arrangement with Brenia became both a political reality and a quiet human arrangement. He had protected her sons. She had provided the province with a talent for pacifying populations. Both had profited in the currency of survival and influence. In the end, Brenia did not restore the Nervi to a patch of uninterrupted land. The fields remained broken, the graves remained unfilled, but in a different ledger, one that measured people by the stories they carried forward rather than by the banners they raised. She had not failed. Her people persisted in songs tucked into the hems of slaves' tunics, in lullabies hummed in Latin houses, in the notches behind a cupboard slat. Her sons carried a duality that made them dangerous and useful, and the Druid network, scattered but alive, grew into a set of safe houses that could shelter more than fugitives. They sheltered memory. There is a price to this kind of survival. Brenia paid it with a life of exile, of learned submission, and the constant calibration of truth. She learned to look at Roman men without hate that burned the mind. She learned to use their bureaucratic soft spots as tools. She learned to think in ledger and lullaby at once, to count both coin and tail. Her moral landscape became a lattice of compromises, and she never pretended otherwise. When she finally visited the places where her people's tents had once stood, she found only thin markers, a stone scraped with a name here, a hearthstone half buried there. She placed a line of herbs on one of the stones and sang a word in Nervian that her sons had never heard, in the language of their tutors. They listened, and they learned the syllable as if it were a small flame. There was a final reckoning that she permitted herself, quiet and without crowd. She visited the place where Caddoc had been taken and sent, as many Nervi did, a single strand of her braid to be burned on the altar there. The act was private, as all true reckonings often are. It did not bring him back. It did not undo the spectacle of the king's head on a spear. But it closed a circle of kinship that had been severed and told her something necessary, that vengeance, like governance, was a craft that changed hands and shapes, but never erased sorrow. In the years that followed, she taught a small cohort of women and men how to archive memory in forms that looked innocuous to Roman eyes. A recipe book that contained a map, a hymn whose broken meter revealed a name, a nursery rhyme whose second line hid a password. They embedded the past into the present so cunningly that centuries could pass without officials recognizing the continued existence of a people in miniature. This, she believed, was the quietest form of victory. The disturbing reality of Roman soldiers and the wives of defeated tribes was not only the visible cruelty, the trophies, the sails, the mounted heads. It was also the systematic way an empire repackaged human lives into instruments of order. But that reality contained as well the possibility of adaptation. Women like Brenia converted suffering into strategy. They traded short-term submission for long-term survival and used the very tools of empire to keep their people's memory and rhythms alive. There is a temptation in stories like these to seek a tidy moral, an absolute villain, an absolute triumph. The truth is less theatre and more ledger. Moral choices are messy. Survival is often indistinguishable from compromise. Revenge does not return what was lost. Brenia never sought to be a martyr or a saint. She sought to be a vessel through which the Nervi's stories continued. In that modest aim was a stubborn sort of justice. If there is a rarity in her success, it lies in the fact that memory can outlast monuments. The wives of defeated tribes carried, in their chests and in their lullabies, the names of fields and the grammar of ritual. Rome could take banners and rename cities, but the small practices, the way to cut bread, an embroidered knot, a whispered prayer, could cross borders in the palms of women who learned how to speak two tongues. Remember this as you think of the image that began our story. A head on a spear and a woman with blood that was not her own pressed into the hollows of her face. The spectacle was meant to signal an end. What followed was a long and strategic endurance. The disturbing reality included the humiliation and the threat, and it included how those burdens were met with cunning endurance and sometimes with quiet retribution. If this story has reached you with the weight it deserves, and you wish to see more histories like this brought from places that empires tried to silence, share this account so that the wives and the quiet resistances they carried are not forgotten. In the last scene, Brenia sat by a low fire with her sons beside her, the city's distant murmur beyond the walls. She taught them a song that was older than the Conquest, a melody whose words named small things: clay, reed, river. She watched them mouth those names in both tongues. It was not restoration. It was perhaps the only kind of continuity that had any real hope. She thought of the women scattered across provinces, wives who had become matrons, slaves, concubines, or ghosted figures in Domus records, and she held their memory as one would tend a secret garden. In a world that prized spectacle, they had learned to be roots. In a world that catalogued bodies, they had preserved language. The Empire had sought to reclassify them. They had reclassified themselves as carriers of memory. The disturbing reality, finally, is the lesson that survival imprints on the soul. The strategies people use to keep a people alive are often ugly, often compromised, but they work in ways that Empire's ledger never fully understands. Remember the wives, remember the bargains, remember the ways memory travels. Share this story so these histories remain in the mouths of those who will speak them to the next generation.